So even something like major depression used to have a grief exemption, that if you had just lost a loved one, you were grieving. You didn't have major depression. You had grief, and that is normal. It's not a disorder. In fact, you would be a robot. You'd lack humanity if you weren't grieving. And so just as an example, now the grief exemption is taken away so that if you go in and say, wow, my father just passed away. Oh, here's some Prozac. Take an SSRI. When any rational, to your point, a nuanced understanding is that you are a human who is suffering, as humans do, because we possess emotions. Welcome to Love and Life. I'm Dr. Karen Anderson Abril, here with my co-host,
Pastor Elliot Anderson.
And Love and Life is your place to hear conversations grounded in psych research, psychotherapy,
and biblical truth
to help us thrive in love and life. All right, so we are picking up where we left off with Dave Wayne, and today we're going to talk about the transgender movement. It's a huge topic that has become this culture war clash. People feel that you're really abusive and cruel if you don't let, for example, a child who says, I'm the opposite sex, if you don't give them gender affirming care is what we call it. Other folks say, it is abusive to allow a child. We don't let a child get a tattoo. We don't let them drink or smoke. We don't let them vote. We don't let them drive. We have a lot of things that we protect children from because we know that their brains aren't fully developed until now. The most recent research says mid-20s, even late 20s. So we want to protect children. And so on the other side of the argument, we say, children aren't prepared to cognitively be able to reason through their sex yet. And there's research that shows that if you let them go through this phase, that they're going to sort things out once they get through puberty. So we're going to delve into all of that. And we're also going to see this through a pharma lens, because Dave and I both have some deep concerns about the pharmaceuticals industry's capture on so many realms of our lives. So we're going to look at this, what pharmaceutical corporations, how they are a part of this conversation. Dave, I'll let you take it from there and just set up the scenario for us. Some people I don't know how you can avoid this topic right now. I think most people are pretty aware of what's going on, but set up what's going on through your lens as a psychiatric nurse.
Sure. Well, this is certainly a very charged topic. And what's been frustrating for me as a mental health professional is that I've seen things just thrown out the window that are fundamental knowledge that we've known as mental health professionals for decades. But at the same time, you don't need letters behind your name to see that some of these things just don't pass a simple sniff test. And so there really is a burden of evidence that needs to be provided by the people who are saying, no, we need to be giving these kids hormones. No, we need to be doing surgeries and affirming this. If we don't, it can be deadly. They have a really high burden of proof just because what they're saying is so contrary to everything that we've understood in the past, and because those interventions are so extreme. So is that burden of proof there? Yes, they would argue that it is. The other thing that's been frustrating to see about this conversation is the complete lack of nuance, and I find that very frustrating. I've worked with transgender adults before, and I've also worked with just a multitude of teens who are going through a normal teen identity crisis. And as mental health professionals, we also know about autogynephilia. We know about drag queens. And for some reason, in this conversation, all these things are getting lumped together as if they're the same thing. And we know that they're not. We know that these are completely different things. And I will be the first to say, I'm going to say some things that are very, very critical about transgender care for adolescents. That is completely separate from adults making decisions. I've worked with a lot of transgender adults. What they go through is hellish, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. That's what's very frustrating about this, is because if you critique one part of it, all of a sudden you're just overall a transphobe. You're a person to be canceled. You're a person to not be listened to, and that's very frustrating to watch.
There's definitely a lack of nuance. And as this became really over the last 10 years, I think, a very fringe, very rare occurrence, we didn't see a lot of this. Again, as a psychologist, I'm familiar with the DSM and how it changes. When I was first getting my master's in clinical psych, so preparing to be a therapist back in the 90s, the DSM-3R was the iteration at the time. And it was probably gender dysphoria, I think is what the term was. And it was certainly considered a mental illness, a psychiatric illness. Whereas now it's morphed. I don't even know if it still exists in the DSM-5, because I'm really not a big fan of the DSM, because I think because it changes with the wind. And because we don't have diagnostic tools. It's just like a checklist. And of course, and an example that I think is appalling is because the DSM is a tool that psychiatrists put together, who are psychiatrists are medical doctors. So they're very pharma friendly. And so many of the diagnoses now are ones that are going to be treated with a pharmaceutical. Surprise, surprise. So even something like major depression used to have a grief exemption, that if you had just lost a loved one, you were grieving. You didn't have major depression. You had grief, and that is normal. It's not a disorder. In fact, you would be a robot. You'd lack humanity if you weren't grieving. And so just as an example, now the grief exemption is taken away, so that if you go in and say, wow, my father just passed away. Oh, here's some Prozac, take an SSRI. When any rational, to your point, a nuanced understanding is that you are a human who is suffering, as humans do, because we possess emotions.
We are thrilled to announce our partnership with Authentics Athletic Apparel, spelled with 2 X's at the end, because it's our XX chromosomes that make us female. And contrary to current belief, no amount of hormones, no number of surgeries can change that. And no female athlete should have to compete against men. But at the moment, this is exactly what's happening in both amateur and professional sports. It's not fair, nor is it safe. Wearing Authentics lets us take a stand to support and protect female athletes. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it, we're protecting the future of womanhood. Authentics gives 10% of all sales to the Independent Women's Forum, the nonprofit which fights for women's causes, including our right to our own spaces and our right to compete against other women, and only other women. Check out Authentics.com and use promo code LOVELIFE for 10% off your purchase. That's Authentics.com, AUTHENTIXX.com, and use promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 10% off your purchase.
But getting back to the trans situation, you mentioned there's just so many aspects to it. And I've evolved from, I think, being maybe a little bit more compassionate, because I see that now, I don't want to say that. I hear what you're saying about an adult. And I think we should go through each of because we should take a nuanced approach to this. We should look at protecting children, as I talked about at the top. But also adults, if you have autogynephilia, which this is something where you are, I don't know if it's just for men, but my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're a man who becomes sexually aroused by parading around as a woman. And I don't know if that also involves like being in female spaces, knowing that women are uncomfortable. I don't know how the extent of it. But there comes a point where you being what to my mind is still, this is a psychiatric illness at this point. This is a mental illness of some sort. And then coming into my women's restroom, well, now your emotional problem is infringing upon my rights. So that it comes, there's a point where even I hear what you're saying, like as an adult, like I'm a libertarian at heart. I'm like, as an adult, you should do whatever you want. No one should tell you what to do. That's my first, but then also you can't do what you want and invade my right to have a protected space. So it gets so complex, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's bizarre to watch these things get lumped together, because they're very, very, very different. A transgender adult wants to pass as a member of the opposite sex. They don't want to draw all this attention. They don't want people to think, hey, is this person in the wrong restroom? They don't want any of that. Versus a drag queen, somebody with autogynephilia, it's part of their kink. It is, they want to dress as a caricature of a woman and have all the attention in the room on them. And these are completely different things. And for you to think that maybe it's wrong to have children participate in that, that's not transphobic. These are completely separate things. If you don't want your child to participate in a grown man's kink, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I'm very libertarian like you, and I'm not slamming drag queens. If you go to a drag show that's, for adults, you might have a hilarious time. It might be fantastic entertainment, and that's fine. I'm perfectly okay with that. But let's not pretend that if you don't want your child to participate in that you're some sort of bigot. Let's not pretend that parents at a school shouldn't be allowed to weigh in on whether there are drag queen events at their school. I think parents are perfectly reasonable to have a big problem with that.
Yeah, and that's so interesting too. One of the accounts that I follow on Instagram, and I went to a protest in 2022. It was right before Children's Health Defense's first ever annual conference, and in Knoxville. And on the way down, I stopped in Nashville because Matt Walsh's group was having a protest because Vanderbilt was doing transgender surgeries on children. So it was a whole stop the genital mutilation of children. Again, keeping it to children, and this is something that was happening in the UK at the Tavistock Institute, and I believe they've shut it down. So most other Western countries with whom we typically share some common values have said, no, not for children. To your point, there's a distinction here we need to make between children and adults. And Gays Against Groomers was there, and they are a wonderful organization that just says, hey, let's stop lumping this all together. Partly it's lumped together because LGBT is all lumped together. And so then, we've talked about before, I have a lot of gay friends, and some of them see this as, and I think they identify, and we've had some conversations about it, and sometimes it gets heated. I think they think about themselves when they were 12 years old, and a young boy is like, I'm gay, but I'm not permitted to come out yet. My culture, wherever they're living as a child, especially in my day, like as in the 80s, 70s and 80s, they didn't feel comfortable coming out. So they then have empathy for a 12-year-old who believes that he or she is the opposite sex and feels like they want to extend that empathy that they felt that they wish they had more permission to be who they were at that tender age. And they're extending that to a child who believes that they're trans and not taking into consideration the thing that the reality that we're talking about, that there is identity crises that adolescents experience. This was a more dramatic one perhaps, but the research does show, I believe I saw something recently, that 90% of kids will move through this, and at the end of puberty, they'll be back to being comfortable in their own skin. So speak to that a little bit. Also, I love the whole distinction between like drag queen story hour at a public library or at your school versus adults going to like do whatever you want. I mean, I lived in Chicago. I was hanging out in Boys Town all the time, and do whatever you want as an adult. But it's perfectly reasonable for a parent to be like, I just don't want you sexualizing my kids. And that's what Gays Against Groomers is all about. They're like, please stop thinking that every gay person wants to have a drag show at your child's school. We don't. We find that abhorrent. We find that totally inappropriate and grooming. I mean, they put it in the name. That's grooming a child to be aware of sexual things that it robs a child of innocence. Let the child be a child.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up Tavistock. So that was the gender affirming care clinic for all of the UK. It was where every kid was sent when they said something that made their providers concerned that they would need transgender care. And there was a lot of controversy around that clinic, just like there is over here in the US with gender affirming care. So the UK decided to do a deep dive into their standards of care and into their patient outcomes. So they started a project called the Cass Review. This is named after Dr. Hilary Cass. She was a renowned pediatrician over in the UK, and she had a whole team look into the outcomes that they were getting at the Tavistock Clinic and looking into the research upon which their guidelines were based. And they spent a couple years doing that. And when they finished, they released a report. It's called the Cass Report, that was very, very damning about what they were doing in the UK. They did not have a solid evidence base for anything that they were doing. And some of these interventions are very extreme. They lead to infertility and lifelong sexual dysfunction. And they were not reducing suicide rates. And after this report was released, they shut the whole thing down. Now, what the headlines said about Tavistock closing was, oh, there's such a demand, they're not able to keep up with the demand for this type of care, and this care is very important, so we shut the whole thing down. Makes absolutely no sense. If you had like an incredible demand for some sort of specialized cancer treatment, and you only had one center doing that kind of cancer treatment and they couldn't keep up with it, you wouldn't say, well, that's a problem, let's shut them down. Like that explanation makes absolutely no sense. And one of the other interesting things about the Cass report is the standard that was set by social media companies during COVID. So during COVID, a lot of social media companies decided, you know what, we need to censor people. We're only going to allow links from official government websites or organizations like the WHO, because there's just too much disinformation going on out there about how, COVID vaccines don't prevent transmission, about how there might be side effects to COVID vaccines. We need to shut all that down. We're only going to allow links to official government websites. Well, now, newspapers and social media companies are in full election mode. And I see all these posts being made about how Tim Walz, right across the state line from me here in Wisconsin, over in Minnesota, he's made Minnesota a trans refuge state. And so there are lots of media articles about how fantastic that is, and about how these red states that are banning gender affirming care are backwards bigots who are driving children to suicide. If I try and link to the official UK website Cass report, those links get deleted. They're not following their own rules about only linking to official government websites when it's to a link that doesn't fit the narrative. It's very alarming.
Well, it's very alarming. And like I said, typically, at least growing up, it was understood that you would look at, so for example, the UK, like their flagship Tavistock Institute that has this incredible reputation, blah, blah, blah. We would look to them and go, okay, let's pump the brakes then. If this is what they found in this Cass report, let's look at that. And we need to use other Western countries that we were based on the Enlightenment and based on the knowledge that we apply the scientific method and we approach it and we have rigorous research. And so we would share resources and share information, and we would absolutely look to them and go, okay, wait a minute. We need to consider what's going on here based on what they found in this report from the UK. And yet we're not doing that. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. So my question, Dave, is that because we are so pharma ruled? Because every child that you can get on puberty blockers will become a patient for life.
I do think that you can pull on some threads and trace it back to pharma. I think a lot of it goes back to the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, which was a point in time where kind of the Democrat establishment went from being very cynical about pharma to embracing the power that pharma money can bring them in terms of campaign contributions during primaries and that sort of thing. And when when practitioners who support gender affirming care are justifying and promoting these programs to their hospitals, they do talk about the incredible amount of money that is brought in from these procedures, from these hormones and from these surgeries and from the follow-up care. They are incredibly lucrative for hospitals. And at the end of the day, even nonprofit hospitals, they are all about generating revenue. They are a business. They are in the healthcare business, but it is first and foremost about business and not about healthcare.
And then, and I want to have you on again to talk about that, because right now my head wants to go to trying to understand how we could have a model of healthcare that wouldn't be a business, because obviously it pays. Hospitals need to fill their beds. They need us sick. I mean, and that sounds so twisted, but it's not. It's logical. And yet, I don't know, my understanding is that a full socialized system, you have people in Canada who come down here to get procedures because the waiting list is so long. That's a conversation I'd like to delve into another day. I know RFKJ talks about, because I never understood this switch. We've talked about it. You and I have talked about it extensively. Again, from people on the Democrats being very anti-big pharma, anti-big business, to being now completely the opposite. In fact, all of our big businesses are voting Democrat right now, from big tech to big pharma to big everything. I mean, we incentivize all the wrong things when it comes to healthcare. And that's part of what concerns me too. You mentioned that these young people get on these puberty blockers, and I believe I've heard this. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Physicians, pediatricians might say, just put them on the blockers. We'll just delay puberty until they sort things out. There's no delaying puberty to the extent that you will have irreversible damage. These children then, if you say they want to switch back, or even if they don't switch back, they are like you said, there's research to support that they may never be able to procreate. It may damage their reproductive systems so much. So girls obviously won't be able to breastfeed should they change their mind and want to become mothers someday. If they are able to get pregnant, there's research that suggests they may never be able to achieve orgasm. So they will be denied one of the most pleasurable experiences that a human can experience in sexual pleasure with a partner, that deep intimacy. They won't. I'm concerned, Dave. I'm concerned as a developmental psychologist. I'm looking down 10, 15 years, and I think we're going to have a rash of suicides when someone wakes up at 30, wonders where the adults were in the room to say, this is a phase. Let's do some other things, but we're not going to put you on medication for the rest of your life. We're not going to chop off body parts. I think we're going to have a 30-year-old who has parts missing, can't have a typical functioning sexual relationship, has never achieved orgasm, can't reproduce, and is now going, what happened to me? That, I think, is going to be putting people in a suicidal state.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick point of clarification. Transgender care is very red and blue. It's very divided along party lines. But overall, the capture of Washington by pharma companies is absolutely a bipartisan disaster. It is the Washington establishment, both Republicans and Democrats, that have embraced their corporate overlords. So I don't want to completely put it all on the Democrats. This is a bipartisan failure, and it speaks to the importance to drain the swamp. It speaks the importance to completely reform these federal institutions and things like campaign finance, and get some real transparency and accountability, and get the justice system back so that the ghouls can be prosecuted. In terms of puberty blockers and that sort of thing, that was one of the revelations that came out of the WPATH files earlier this year.
What's that stand for, though, Dave, for someone?
WPATH stands for the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. Okay. So this is the organization that sets the standard for the rest of the world in terms of what is the evidence-based treatment for children experiencing gender dysphoria. This is who we follow, and this is who the rest of the world used to follow. At this point, all the Scandinavian countries who were doing this sort of thing long before the US was, they've done a complete 180. They don't do it anymore. They looked at their long-term data. They have universal healthcare, so they're able to actually track these patients well over time and look at their outcomes. They were seeing things like young women getting osteoporosis when they were in their late teens, early 20s. They would have the spine of an 80-year-old, and from puberty blockers. They were looking at, does this improve their mental health? Does this decrease rates of suicide? And no, it doesn't. So they stopped. They don't do it anymore in essentially the rest of the Western world, except for the US. It has become this incredibly contentious issue. There's been so much that has come out that strongly suggests we should absolutely hit the brakes. And, I really don't like the thought of the government interfering in the doctor-patient relationship, but I could definitely see an argument in this case for a nationwide ban on gender-affirming care, just because it is so egregious, and they are completely violating some of the foundational values that we are supposed to have as healthcare professionals. Things like evidence-based practice, things like informed consent. Per the standard setters themselves, it is impossible for a 13-year-old to understand what it means that they will never get pregnant, to understand what it means that they will never have an orgasm. They even say that a lot of the time, the health literacy of the parent, they don't even understand it. So this is not something they say publicly. This is from leaked files from this organization, WPATH. They are setting the standard of care for the country. Internally, what they're saying is kids can't consent to what we're saying should be done to them. Parents can't even really consent a lot of the time to what we're saying should be done to their children. And we only know that because whistleblowers leaked documents.
So getting back to the why, if these other countries who, again, we typically would respect and at least look at what they found and make some recommendations for our practices here, if it's not a pharma thing, or if it's partly a pharma thing, I would imagine, but why? What is the point here? What is going on? Why?
It's a belief system. It's a belief system. They do not believe in evidence-based practice. They believe in transgender ideology. It's parallel to, critical race theory and critical gender theory, postmodern Marxism. These are all belief systems where, one of the systems of Western society that they would like to overthrow is evidence-based practice. Everything for them comes down to oppressor and oppressed, and that worldview and that belief system. So they are still true believers. When they even internally talk about kids are not able to give informed consent for this, that does not cause them to hit the brakes. They do not see that as a problem. They still believe but the right thing to do is to do it anyway. They are still full speed ahead with it because it's a belief system, and the belief system is not about evidence-based practice. And when you look at the evidence they cite too, for somebody who does believe in evidence-based practice, it just falls apart with even the most mild amount of scrutiny. And I'll give a very specific example. There was a study that came out of Seattle Children's Gender Clinic back in 2022. It's called Mental Health Outcomes in Transgender and Non-Binary Youth Receiving Gender-Affirming Care. This is by Tordoff et al., published in JAMA Network Open under Pediatrics. And this made headlines across the country. What they found was that the receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with a 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over a 12-month follow-up. So this was in headlines everywhere, mainstream media, the national news, small town papers. I saw headlines about this, and it was because all these red states were passing laws banning this type of care. And so they were essentially saying like these red states are killing children. They're not following the evidence. And the problem with that is that study, when you actually look at the data, their conclusions are not supported by their own data at all whatsoever. This study was 104 kids aged 13 to 20, and they had two groups. One group was either receiving puberty blockers and hormones, and the other group was not receiving puberty blockers and hormones. And the kids who got puberty blockers and hormones had a really, really high rate of depression and suicidal thoughts prior to those treatments. And they still had a really, really high rate after receiving those treatments. We're not even sure where they came up with these percentages for how much they dropped. They haven't themselves been transparent about that because they've been criticized. They've been criticized for it. Like, hey, how did you come up with these numbers? And they basically responded, we used a formula that we came up with, and people asked for the formula and they won't share it. But in terms of just overall numbers, the number of kids who benefited from this treatment, like it wasn't there. And the other really damning thing about this article was the rate of attrition. So normal studies like this are going to have some amount of attrition, meaning people who exit the study before it's finished. If it's 5-10%, that's pretty normal, but that's getting to the point where it starts to invalidate the results. If you have that many people leave, people are going to move, stuff like that. People are going to drop out. In this study, they had something like 40 some of the kids ended up dropping out of the study, which is a huge percent of them. And this isn't a study that's meant to justify that people are going to stick with this long term and that these permanent changes are right. And
right.
Their own study participants didn't stay in. That says a lot about the narrative that they're pushing, that they ignore the fact that most of their own patients said, you know what, I actually don't want to continue forward with this. When we talk about detransitioners and things like that, and these injured, wounded people who went through these treatments and then regretted it, like that's a huge hot topic. And in their own study, a huge amount of their patients detransitioned before even a year, and they're still saying, well, it's lowering the rates of depression and suicidality without any evidence that it actually is. And it is so frustrating because, again, you don't even need letters after your name to glance through things like this and go like, this is complete BS, they're lying. Yet we have all these uncritical journalists and uncritical media stations and just all these people who just read the headline and
that's right.
Confirmation bias, it fits their narrative. They go, well, look, there's more evidence that the people in Tennessee who banned gender affirming care are bigots, and the people in Texas who did this are murderers. When you lift up the hood and you actually look at the data, and like it's just, it ain't there. That's what the entire rest of the world has realized. But we have the last holdouts over here, and I don't see cracks in their armor either. I don't see these people. I don't see these people waking up. They're doing it to their own children. That's how embedded they are. That's how completely caught up in this ideology they are. They are true believers. They're doing it to their kids, and they will do it to your kids. Tim Walz will take custody of kids from Wisconsin whose parents won't do this to them. He made Minnesota a trans refuge state. They will interfere in the parent-child relationship at a legal level to do this to kids. And they say that they're heroes and that this is a good thing that they're doing this. This is really alarming and scary stuff.
It's terrifying to interfere with a parent-child relationship as if you have the authority to do so. So this Wisconsin kid goes to Minnesota, and then Minnesota kidnaps the child from the parents because the parents are so horrible, not letting the child get on puberty blockers. I mean, this is, and it's, it's so astounding on so many levels. Even thinking about the research study, they just are guaranteeing that people will be lazy enough just to read the headlines, not do even like a cursory look through the methodology. If 40% of the kids leave the study, I want to have an exit interview. I want to understand, we need to collect that data too. They're not doing that. They're not interested in that at all. And then to the point about the ideology, which is I'm so confused about, always confused.
As you know, we've been partnering with the Wellness Company for several months now. And personally, as someone who sadly no longer trusts the vast majority of medical professionals, I am so happy to be able to share the Wellness Company's array of products with the Love and Life community. Dan and I just purchased the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit, which includes vital medications with proven safety profiles like ivermectin, amoxicillin, and Z-Pak. The kit also includes a comprehensive guidebook researched and written by the company's chief medical board, including esteemed doctors who stood up to COVID tyranny, by the way, which is exactly why they've earned our trust. Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and Dr. Paul Alexander, just to name a few. Head over to twc.health/lovelife and enter promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 15% off your order. That's twc.health/lovelife and promo code LOVELIFE for 15% off your order. We can take charge of our health, and the Wellness Company is here to help us do it.
So at this rally I went to back in 2022, there's a woman named Chloe Cole, and she's spoken before Congress and so forth. She was a detransitioner. Her breasts were removed at 15. Her voice is low. She's not sure what her future looks like, reproductively speaking. Maybe she's had some assessments done, so she knows at this point she's not going to breastfeed her children if she's able to have them. She was up there, and there were counter protesters. Dave, I cannot tell you how horrible they were to her. Screaming, F you. This girl's like 19, 20 years old at the time. Just sharing what she went through. Her body mutilated, the body parts just lopped off, healthy breasts removed. She has a right to have a voice and share her opinion on this topic because she's lived it. They were screaming F-bombs at her, just vitriol spewing. And of course, the rest of us were trying to support her and thank her for her authenticity and her honest and vulnerability. And these people, so to your point, when you start talking about an ideology, like a religious fervor, that she's not allowed to say, mistakes were made. And I am the exact reason that we need to be cautious, because I don't want other little girls to be 19, 20 years old with no breasts. And they had no room. They're so compassionate though, Dave. They're so compassionate. They had nothing, no room for her to give her opinion. In fact, it wasn't even just like not providing space for her. They were actively, like, it was scary. The evil coming from these people, it was scary. I was glad that they had security and so forth, because I was like, she can't walk to her car. These people will attack her. It was horrifying.
Yeah, and the amount of hypocrisy. This is the same crowd that'll say things like choose kindness and listen to all voices and that sort of thing. And then you see how absolutely vicious they are. I've been following the issue of detransitioning since about 2019 or something like that. I found a forum on Reddit called r/dtrans, where it's people who have been through this and regretted transitioning, and now they're trying to navigate life. They're trying to navigate their own bodies. They're trying to navigate relationships when they're in a point where they are going to have sexual dysfunction for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And it's horrific. It is horrific what they go through. Yeah. If you want to hear from some of these people themselves, just go to the forum. I just pulled it up now, and what you can read is just an incredible amount of grief. People who have grief over they will never have their voice back because the hormones change their voice. People who will always have body hair in places that they don't want body hair because of what these hormones did to them. People who have problems with they burned bridges when they transitioned and they lost these relationships, and now they've detransitioned and their family relationships and their old friendships are completely destroyed. And you can also read a lot of resentment towards the healthcare professionals who did this to them. It's so easy. It's so easy. These people are not well screened at all to do something this permanent. And again, like, this is so obvious, and the insanity of it, just like it is difficult to understand, because, can you buy cigarettes? No. Can you buy a lighter? No. Can you get a tattoo? No. Can you vote? No. Can you join the military? No. Can you drive? No. Can you have your breasts removed? And can you take some hormones that are going to remove your ability to have an orgasm or ever reproduce? Yes. Make it make sense. It just doesn't. It's such an untenable belief system that I really don't understand. It's really difficult to. I don't know how we bridge the gap with these people, Karen. I don't know how we find common ground, and that's a huge problem, because we're all living here together in the same country, in the same society. We're going to the same schools. We're working in the same places. I don't know how we bridge this gap. Do you have any ideas on how this situation is remedied, or how to reach people?
And I think we need to devote an entire episode on that, because I think that is at the core. Love and Life is started as kind of a relationship podcast, and then as a psychologist who's always been concerned about these more holistic concerns as well. I've always been anti-affirmers. We've talked about extensively. So I was always bringing that to the conversation too. But I think at this very divisive time where, again, where people like, I know we got to wrap up because I want to be respectful of your time. But I think we could just press pause here and try to get to getting into some strategies because what you just said, and I do love ending on this theme. There's so much. You had so much grace and love in your heart when you were going through this Reddit and saying, I don't want a young person to have those experiences. I don't want them to have this grief and regret and wonder, where were the adults in the room? Why wasn't somebody looking out for me? Why did they let these doctors do these things? You were coming from a place of love. And to your point, the broader narrative paints us as phobic and cruel, and we're just being partisan, which we're not. Like you said, it's really, it shouldn't be a political divide with this. It should be a scientific reasoning. Like you said, it should be based on research. It's not. It should be based on what we do with children, how we protect children in other domains, as you just spoke to. We don't let them do things that they're not capable of doing yet. So this is something that I think we can try to get to some of those strategies. I think, again, to underscore what you said as well, unfortunately, because once a side is taken, it seems like the confirmation bias is there, like you said, and also it seems like it's an ideology that really, like we said a moment ago, blurs into like almost a religiosity, to where you have to be as dogmatic as possible, or else there's no crack, like you said, no crack in that armor, because then you're looking like those other people and we hate them and we know they are evil. Whereas I really don't feel like people like you and I having this conversation, I don't see anyone as evil. I shouldn't say that. The doctors, some of those doctors I think are evil, and I think some of the pharmaceutical
there might be a couple out there.
But I don't think that a parent who, like Chloe Cole's parents, I don't think they were evil. I think they really listened. I think they did not get informed consent. I'm sure they didn't. I'm sure they were told better to have an alive son than a dead daughter, all the things that parents are told. So I just want to, I can't answer your question, but let's think about that. Let's revisit this, because I do think that finding that common ground again and trying to come from a place of love is where I always come from. I think in my head, but I think sometimes when I'm speaking, I get a little energy behind it. I think you come from a very calm place of love and grace, and I hope that can be received. Any parting thoughts as we wrap up, Dave, on this topic? But again, this is just more to come.
Yeah, no, it sounds good, Karen. I think you put it really well there, and it is a really important conversation to have, to try and figure out how to bridge the gap here. I'm at a complete loss. Everything that I've tried has failed, whether it's regarding trans care, regarding COVID, with people who are just absolute true believers. It seems like it doesn't matter what you put in front of them. It's almost a religious belief. So I would be glad to have that conversation, because it's something that in my experience I've completely failed at.
Same. Same. All right. But yeah, thank you so much for your time as always and your expertise. And I'm just so thankful we've found each other and that you can be Love and Life's special guest star. And I just appreciate you always being willing to join us for these conversations, and we'll just continue and we'll hope and we'll pray and we'll believe for healing, because it really is going to take a lot of healing on the personal, emotional, and even physical level for some of these young people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen.
Yeah, thanks.
Love and Life with Dr. Karen and Pastor Elliot is produced by Tim May and executive producer Dr. Karen Anderson-Abel. For more information about Love and Life, please go to loveandlifemedia.com.